So you know what I really hate? I really hate it when cliches turn out to be true. Because I feel like the fact that they are cliches means that they ought to always be oversimplifications, always ought to be wrong, always ought to sort of fail to capture the nuance of things. And so when one of them actually helps make better sense of reality, it feels somehow unjust to me in some odd way. And yet this week, as I was thinking about Pentecost and the life of this community, I realized that there was a cliche that was just haunting me and insisting that I talk about it today. And so it won, and so here we are. The cliche is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this really is true of our life as a church. Now, the one other time I've heard that cliche make any sense was in a song from a Broadway show about romantic love. And it made some sense there, but otherwise I hadn't thought about it in years, and then here it came. Now, when we think about the relationship between the whole and the parts, the whole needs the parts. No one's arguing with that. There is no whole without the parts. People who have been around this congregation a while will remember a worship song, I'm probably going to bring it back fairly soon, called I Need You to Survive. A wonderful gospel song. And that is a song in which each of us, as kind of a part of the whole, acknowledges the importance of the other parts of the whole. And yet there's a sense in which the whole is not just the parts added up. There's a kind of additional component that makes the whole more than the sum of its parts. And that additional component is the sacred, or the spirit, or the presence of God. And we see that component making its way in our community through our relationships, through our belonging to one another, because where we see the sacred, where we see the holy, wherever else we may see it in our lives, but in this community, we see it in the space between us. We see it when we interact with one another, when we listen to one another and care for one another and tend to one another. We're all probably familiar with a famous understanding of God as love. We get this from the first letter of the Johannine community that we've probably heard of as called 1 John, or the first letter of John. And the idea that God is love, again, we can understand that in a wide range of ways. But one way of understanding it is that God is made manifest, or incarnated, or embodied, or enfleshed in our connections with one another. And thus we have this famous line from the Gospel according to Matthew where Jesus says, where two or more are gathered, I am among them. And there's a reason for that, because it takes two or more to be in relationship with each other. Today we celebrate and honor Pentecost, that time when the Spirit descended upon the gathered disciples, through tongues of flame, through the ability to speak different languages. And Pentecost is often seen as the birthday of the church. Because I'm in a good mood, I'm not going to go over there and play happy birthday to the church, because you really don't want that. But we do use today to think about what will allow us to move into our future as a religious community. So rather than focusing on the history of the church, the past of the church's origin story, if you will, we are going to think about what will enable us to move forward as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. If you've been around the UCC long enough, you've probably heard the joke that UCC, the initials of our denomination, stands for Untied Church of Christ, rather than United Church of Christ. It actually stands for United Church of Christ. But the joke, of course, is that we are the Untied Church of Christ because we so cherish and value diversity that everyone can see things differently, and when we come together, it's not because we have to believe all the same things or be uniform in everything we do, but that we are welcome to be diverse. And yet, there is something of a risk of becoming untied, right? When we are all pursuing our own agendas, then we can get untied rather than being united. The good thing is that when we are working together for the good of this community, the good of the world, doing God's work in the world as best as we can discern what that is, we are not untied. Then we are, in fact, united. And when I was thinking about that pairing of words, I thought, how interesting that you literally flip or switch two letters and you get the exact opposite, because united and untied are opposites, right? And yet they are the same word with just two letters transposed in the order they come. And that got me thinking about another pairing of words that kind of means the opposite when you just transpose two letters. So to set the context for the second pair of words, I need to admit that I am a huge fan of church sign fails. That humor that happens when someone has been setting up a church sign and they leave a letter out or they spell something wrong. Sometime a few years ago, I remember driving past a church sign in which the passerby was invited to come to church to hear the choir sing. You know. But years ago, decades ago even, I drove past a church sign in which someone had transposed a letter. Maybe they were tired when they put the sign together, I don't know. But that sign invited people to come to church to, and I quote, experience the scared with us. I think they meant the sacred. But that made me think about how sacred and scared are also these opposites. And yet they are the same word with two letters transposed. And sometimes we do get scared even at church. We get scared when we are competing with one another to get our own way, to have our own agenda become the agenda of the church. And that can set up a kind of zero-sum scarcity mindset because, and I'm completely making this up, I'll just pick on David for a moment. You know, David wants something for the church. I want something different from what David wants. Only one of us can get our way. This is not a real example. I'm making it up as I go. But you can see how in that moment, David and I might see each other as kind of threats to one another because we each want something different and we can't both have our way. And when we have that kind of scarcity mindset, that kind of zero-sum mentality, and we become threats to each other in terms of what church is like and what we want, that can actually be scary. I can understand why we'd be a little bit afraid of each other or afraid of each other's agendas. And so the opposite of being scared is being sacred or being gathered within the sacred. And we are gathered within the sacred when we experience ourselves as part of that larger whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Because yes, each of us is a part and we come together and we make the sum. But then the presence of the sacred is that additional component or layer. And when we willingly join together in serving whatever is greater than us, we get to experience that love and abundance that is the sacred. And when that happens, there's a ton of joy. And so we don't want to be scared. We want to be together in the sacred. When I was thinking more about this distinction between the parts and the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, and thinking, what does that look like in a church context? I came up with 3 ideas that I want to mention briefly. All of them in some sense are connected to Pentecost, but none of them are really reducible to it. These are the ideas of covenant, unity, and freedom. And so in the Bible, the covenant, which we see frequently, is a sacred agreement or sacred promise between God and God's people. We see this especially in the Jewish scriptures where the covenant is between God and Israel. And you could even say that whatever else the Jewish scripture is, it is one long story of God making agreements with God's people over and over and over again, and God's people breaking those agreements over and over and over again, and God taking a big, deep breath and making a new covenant that will then be broken, and then a new covenant will be made, and so on and so on. This continues over and over again. That very first covenant we see in Scripture is actually right after the flood, when God promises Noah and Noah's family, and also, incidentally, all of creation, that God will not flood the earth again. And that time, God says, this covenant's on me, you don't have any obligations. But all the later covenants are mutual promises. And the people get them wrong over and over and over again. And so we come to the prophet Jeremiah, who is looking around him with dismay at the state of the Israelites, breaking their agreements again and again and again, and seeing how this is causing them pain and oppression in his interpretation of the thing. And so Jeremiah dares to dream about a day when the covenant, the sacred agreement, the holy promise will work differently. Instead of being written on legal documents or stone tablets, it will be written on the hearts of the people. That's what Jeremiah dares to dream. And this is a dream that the covenant will be grounded in relationship, not in rules. It won't be a list of commandments. It won't be a set of marching orders. It will be the love that the people have for themselves and one another and God. And Jeremiah dares to dream in that moment that the covenant will come down to this one sentence: I will be their God and they shall be my people. It's so interesting, by the way, how often complex understandings of how the world should be wind up coming down to a phrase or an idea. For Jesus, it's the two great commandments: love God with all you've got, love your neighbor as though your neighbor were a part of you. For the prophet Micah, it's that we ought to seek justice and love kindness and live humbly. So for Jeremiah, this dreamed of covenant is that God says, I will be their God and they shall be my people, and the people actually keep the covenant this time. Now, of course, this is a hard covenant for us to follow, not because it has 613 commandments, but because in this covenant we belong to God and we belong to one another, not only to ourselves. So we are not just the free floating individual parts out in the world. We owe something to one another. We've made a promise to one another. We've made an agreement with God. And that is one way of understanding what it means to be part of a religious community where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And then we get to the idea of unity. We sometimes call this Christian unity, and thus the little passage from the letter to the Ephesians. Now, this letter may or may not have been written by Paul. Lots of letters have Paul's names on them in the New Testament that Paul definitely didn't write. This one we're not really sure about. But I love this passage because it's this tender prayer that we maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And whatever you believe doctrinally, the idea of being in unity with the sacred and the idea of being in peace, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds pretty good to me. But this requires something of us. It requires humility and gentleness or tenderness. It requires patience, and it requires that thing that we all hate so much, bearing with one another, because that's not so easy. Now, this isn't in the passage, but I think that prayer also demands love. And thus we get the idea of Christian unity that's lifted up in the hymn we are about to sing, We Are One in the Spirit. And the end of each of those verses is, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Not by our doctrines, not by our creeds, not by our rituals, not by all the things we restrict ourselves from doing, but by our connection with ourselves, loving ourselves, our connection with one another, loving our community, our connection with the whole world, loving our neighbors, loving our enemies, and of course, loving God however we understand God. Now, the thing about unity, being one in the Spirit, is it's not uniformity. It's really helpful for us to remember that we are still our individual selves. We are still our separate parts. I was visiting with Carolyn Gunning in the hospital a couple of days ago, and she said, one thing I love about the United Church of Christ is there might be 5 of us sitting in a row next to each other, and we each believe something a little bit different about God or religion or how the universe works, but we can all still sit there next to each other and be part of this community together. And I said, thank you, Carolyn, I'm putting that in the sermon. I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that to someone in the hospital. That could feel pressureful. But I certainly remembered it and walked out feeling grateful about it. And so unity is another way of understanding how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because when we are together in unity, we are still our individual selves, and yet we are part of this sacred larger thing. And finally, we get to the idea of freedom. Now, in the U.S., in our culture, in our society, we tend to think of freedom as meaning autonomy, independence, freedom from restrictions. The way our society thinks about freedom is all about the individual parts. It's not at all about the whole, and it's certainly not about the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And yet that is not the understanding of freedom that we inherit in our religious tradition, or that we inherit from the Jewish tradition from which Christianity emerged. A couple of months ago, I talked about how when God freed the Israelites from bondage or slavery or servitude in Egypt, and again, this is part of the Jews' foundational or formational story. God frees the Israelites, but God does not free the Israelites to wander off as individuals, to be self-actualizing, to be narcissistic, to be self-absorbed. God frees the Israel from bondage in Egypt so that they can be in bondage to God. And this is really uncomfortable, right? But it is absolutely how the Jews understood the story and how we have inherited the story. We might even say God enslaved the Israelites to God's self. And the reason they couldn't be slaves in Egypt is because, as Jesus later said, you cannot have 2 masters. You cannot serve both God and Egypt. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said you cannot serve both God and wealth. But that sensibility goes all the way back to the Exodus story. And so when God calls us into covenant, into relationship, it is into a kind of freedom. And so we then get to the letter Paul wrote to the Galatians. Paul did write this one. God has called us to a free life, Paul says, but it is not a freedom to do whatever we want. It's the freedom to serve one another in love. It's freedom to be part of a greater whole, a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, not just to be individuals on our own, not just to be self-absorbed parts, but to be part of this thing that is greater. Now, something that I find really interesting about the idea of covenant and what it has to do with freedom is when God makes these agreements, these contracts, these promises, and asks people to do the same back with God, God gives up a little bit of God's own freedom to do that, because covenant is about relationship, and real relationships are never coercive, they are never manipulative, they are never bullying. If you are in a relationship, I'm putting that in scare quotes, that is manipulative or bullying or coercive, that's not a real relationship. That's a power play. And so in this story we inherit from the Jews and have picked up in this Christian context, God actually relinquishes a little of God's own freedom and God's own power to be in a mutual relationship with people. And so when we are in covenant, when we are part of that larger whole, we similarly freely choose to give up just a little bit of our freedom. We don't choose to give up all of our freedom, but we choose to give up a little bit of it. And let me give you a really concrete example of what that looks like. We say at the beginning of every worship service that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. We mean that. All people are welcome here. But not all ideas are welcome here. Not all behaviors are welcome here. If someone started taking advantage of this congregation to bully or manipulate others, that wouldn't be acceptable. And we would say to them, you need to stop behaving that way, or you can't be with us, because we can't have that behavior. And if someone walked in the door and said, homosexuality is an abomination before God, it is sinful, and quote-unquote homosexuals are all going to hell, we would say to them, you are welcome here, but that idea is not welcome here. That is not our understanding of the love and grace and inclusion of God. And so you can hold that idea, but that idea is not welcome in this context. And so when we walk in the door here, we freely give up the freedom to behave in ways that might harm others, and we freely give up the sharing of ideas that might harm others, and we've agreed to that. That's part of our covenant. So all people are welcome, but not all ideas are welcome, not all behaviors are welcome. And also we know in this community we are going to get our way some of the time, and we're not going to get our way some of the time. That made-up example before, in which I was gesturing at Dave, and saying, if Dave gets his way in that example, I don't get my way. Well, we all agree that sometimes we're not going to get our way, but we know that sometimes we will. We know that sometimes we might be uncomfortable because someone is going to say something that will make them uncomfortable. But we also know that some of the time we will get to be comfortable, and our comfort might actually make someone else uncomfortable. This is one reason why we try to sing a range of different kinds of music, so that people who love the old stuff will be comfortable some of the time, and people for whom the old stuff is entirely alien will be comfortable some of the time, because that's not all we do, and so on. And in the midst of this freely giving up some freedom, which doesn't sound like a lot of fun, I admit, at the same time we get the joy of connecting with one another. That's part of the payoff for being willing to be a little bit less free, that we get to be in relationship with one another. And because, as does befit Pentecost, you thought today's sermon had nothing to do with Pentecost, but it does, because today we celebrate that extra component, the connection and love that the Spirit rains down on us, not necessarily as tongues of flame, not necessarily as new languages that we didn't speak before, but as a sacred bond between us that draws us together and that makes the whole of Vista Grande Community Church more than the sum of each of our individual parts. I end, as I always do, with questions for the week and a prayer for us all. And these are questions I hope you will maybe take away after the worship service and think about a little bit as the days go on between now and next Sunday. How are we united rather than untied at Vista Grande Community Church? How could we be less untied and more united? How do we partake of the sacred rather than being scared? How could we be less scared and more deeply held by the sacred? What does covenant or sacred agreement or holy promise mean to you? How are you living into it now? How could you live into it more completely? What does Christian unity mean to you? Do others know that we are Christians by our love? How can they tell? And finally, how does the understanding of freedom that I've proposed land with you? How does it feel? How do you freely choose to restrict your own freedom in your life in service of other people or your values or your ideals? And I end, as I always do, with a prayer for us all. I call it that because God knows I need this prayer as much as anyone else at this gathering needs this prayer. May we be one in the Spirit, experiencing sacred connection as we lay down our agendas and our fears. May we be a people of covenant, of holy agreement and sacred promise. May we use our freedom wisely and compassionately to serve each other and the world. Amen.